This is May 18th, and I'm doing a commentary on Pascal Boyer's book, Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought. However, we are going to summarize Chapter 3, which itself is not much about religious anything. It's just about the kind of mind it takes, which is the title of the kind of mind it takes. And I'm going to use his analogies here because I think they really do help the process. He makes an analogy, begins with there's a great scene from Jane Austen's novel about, in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth is looking, she and her aunt and uncle are looking at Pemberley, this great estate of Mr. Darcy. Now, Mr. Darcy at that point has asked her to marry him, and she has refused. So she's looking at it as obviously someone who could have been the mistress of this great estate, and it's an overwhelming estate, huge castle, and amazingly large grounds. It is quite a place. But the place is organized in a very particular way, and that is there's an upstairs and a downstairs. If you've seen either upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey, you will know this. Downstairs is where everything happens. Upstairs is what it's done for, but downstairs is largely invisible. And what it goes on downstairs is a highly specialized, very large staff of people, everything from ladies' maids to butlers to valets to footmen to chef to wine steward, and so on and so on and so on. There are lots and lots and lots of people, and everybody is specialized, and they all stick to their specialties. And this is a good view of the mind. Rather than being an encyclopedia where we have a whole list of things that we've experienced in our life, it is a whole array of specialized systems that he, for the most part, calls inference systems, but there's some variety in that too. But these are small systems that do all kinds of interesting things. As I say, rather than being a catalog for every experience we've ever had, the mind selects and has a bias toward creating these little inference systems that tell us things about what is going on. And so then he tells a story, and this is a story of an dapper old gentleman with a hat who comes out of the backyard, and he's looking around and walking through the yard and moving toward the sidewalk. And on the sidewalk is a child with a dog, and the dog is on the leash, and as the man passes, the dog sees a cat and bursts out toward the cat, and the child can't hold the leash, and the dog runs into the man, who trips, and his hat falls off. In his pocket is where he has put his tools. He has put a screwdriver, among other things, and when he falls over, the screwdriver hurts him, and a policewoman happens to be walking by and sees the hat and grabs it and goes after the man to try to return his hat. When she taps him on the shoulder, the dapper man looks around as though he wants to run away, and indeed he then confesses to the fact that he is stolen from the house that he's been in, and his pockets are full of rings and jewelry, and In a bemused way, the policewoman who was just trying to retrieve his hat has retrieved a robber. So anyway, now it goes through it. He mentions Boyer mentions six potential inference systems operating here. Understanding the physics of solid objects. So the dog hitting the man, solid objects hitting solid object. The man doesn't go through the dog doesn't go through the man. So we know that that is the physics of solid objects. So that is inferred. Not even thought about, just inferred. Understanding physical causation. So the fact that the dog hits the man and the man stumbles, or the dog runs off and the leash is snapped away from the child, that is causation. The cause is the dog. The dog's movement causes the man to stumble. Detecting a goal-directed motion. Well, we know that the dog is an animal, and the dog sees the cat. We see the cat, so we assume that the dog has a goal of getting to the cat. Now, if you are a dog, it's best to stay away from the cat, but because you'll get your nose batted with its claws, and you'll be worse off. But dogs are dogs, and they're going to go after cats if they can. Keeping track of who's who. This is really important. Who is who? It's, this is a series of things that happened, and as we're listening to the story, or if we were in the situation ourselves, we would have to keep track of who was there, and that might change because of the drama. Linking structure to function. That means that we know the function of the screwdriver because we can see its structure as a screwdriver, and we can infer that from the experience. And understanding mental representation. In other words, and there's a little sort of joke going on here, where the policewoman mentally represents the fact she sees that the man has lost his hat, and she's just trying to help him. The man, when he's stopped by the policewoman, is surprised, and he thinks she's there to nab him for his robbery. So he misunderstands. The various things that are going on, there are all kinds of things, but they're all inferred. Causation doesn't exist, really. It's just something that we humans need to make sense of the story. Goal is also something that's invisible. It's going on in the head of the dog, or in the head of the policewoman who's just picked up the hat, in the head of the man, a robber trying to get away. We don't know that at first. Okay, but the term theory might be a bit misleading. He calls all of these things the theory of mind. There is a more precise description. Seeing or otherwise perceiving object actives, perceiving an object activates a particular set of inference systems. Not all objects activate all of them. The fact that a certain type of object activates a certain panoply or variety of inference systems is what we mean when we say that it belongs to a particular category. So if you say that's animal, that's the category, but there are a bunch of inference systems that make our mind go to that category. And we have a number of things going on. Intuitive physics, a goal direction system, intuitive psychology, structural function system, intuitive psychology as well. Instead of having a complex mental encyclopedia with theoretical declarations about what animals and artifacts and persons are, all we have are flags that switch on particular systems and turn other systems off. This, as you will see, saves us a lot of storage room, but it also is much quicker. Then there are really, all of this was done by biologists, but they couldn't say what was the evolutionary, how did the survival of the fittest, how did evolution make these inference systems into a desirable thing? Why is the human mind organized in this way? They couldn't really say anything about it until a bunch of experimental stuff got going on. One was experimental studies in normal adults, which came up with the principles or concepts of adult life. The second, such as causation or goal orientation or structure function, any of those. The cognitive development people, the ones who were working with infants and children, began to develop principles about infancy and how to make it possible to acquire vast amounts of knowledge so quickly. And then in the medical field, the MRI or fMRI came along. That's medical, or that's the imaging that comes from the magnetic resonance of everything. Has a magnetic resonance that is means there are electrons going around and can be measured. Anyway, what MRI allowed was to see parts of you could show a picture to somebody and then you would see what parts of the brain fired off, and they were all over the brain. So these different, we could physically identify some of these inference systems, perhaps. And then cognitive pathologies were identified by neuropsychologists, dealing mostly with people who had deficits in these particular inference systems. Now, medicine has done this a lot. I remember in the 19th century there was a fellow who was working for the railroad and blew a spike through his frontal lobe, and he had been a pleasant, easygoing guy before that, and he was irascible and difficult after that. And one of the medical people did minute detail of what this man's life was like, having lost part of his frontal lobe. That kind of missing piece is something that medicine does all the time. If they measure people's we can't obviously take out or stop parts of the brain, so people who've had parts of the brain stopped gives us information about what that does and what happens. Anyway, he goes on with wheels within wheels, systems in the brain. There just are lots of very specialized systems, inference. A description of our minds as a bundle of inference system differently activated by different objects is better than that of a mental encyclopedia because it is much closer to the way the brain actually is organized. There is no general catalog of all things. We take in all this data and it goes into inference systems that really tell us what's going on, and it's a much faster system. So rather than sort of filing down all the pictures of animals and we see a predator perhaps or a cow or something, we would take a long time to get there if it was an encyclopedic mind, but it isn't. it goes right to an inference system that says, oh, cow, no sweat. Oh, tiger, run. Anyway, and this works for a lot of different things. Specialized mechanisms that constantly produce representations of what is going on inside people's heads in terms of perceptions, intentions, and beliefs. In psychology, that's called a theory of mind. You know, you have a theory about what's going on over there in that mind across the way or next to you. We have to do that because we are social beings and we need to know what's going on in somebody else's mind. And so we have inference systems that help us to guess that fairly well. Now, they're intuitive, so we have to check it out, but nevertheless, there were some interesting things that were learned along the way, and one of them is, for instance, if you make a gesture and wave, the parts of your brain that fire off to make the gesture and make the wave and move the arm and the hand, those are actually the same as if for the person observing another person waving. In the person who is observing, the same areas fire off, but the arm doesn't move. Well, the arm can move, but the same areas, the gesture, the area, the inference that the gesture says, waving, hi, hello, those inferences are the same both in the one who gestures and the one who sees the gesture. To sum up then, our internal description of other people's mental life is not the product of a single general theory of persons, but the outcome of many different perceptions, simulations, and inferences about different aspects of their that they experience. What seems a unified domain of intuitive psychology is in fact a collection of subdomains with specialized systems, and that's how our brain works, apparently. Okay, every nursery school child knows, and he begins by sort of saying, well, you know, most people don't think that children or infants are very smart. They have funny accents, and they just don't seem real quick on the uptake. But as it turns out, children can learn a lot because they know a lot, and their brain is organized in particular ways that infer things, that develop the inference. Okay. So he uses several examples here. One is of a cow that's surgically turned into a horse. Even a fairly young child will say the essence of that is, even though it looks like a horse, is a cow. That's an essentialist view. Is a very early thing in human life. We essentially know that a particular species is that species, whether it looks that way or not. And of course, one of the important things we learn is that animals have species-wide essences, but these are inferred. These are become part of our database. Of course, besides that, there are other systems. There is the facial recognition system. So very, very young babies know, and the only way we can figure that that's communicated is about pacifier intensity and eye contact and that sort of thing. But the caregiver, the main caregiver of the person, that face is very important. But there are other faces that come into view, and people tend to put their face right down to the baby. The baby recognizes those faces. That facial recognition thing is one of the subsystems of our brain. Matter of fact, I'm a photographer, and so one of the early things that's been developed in the digital age is facial recognition, down to the point now where you can focus on a particular eye. If you have a very narrow focal width, you naturally want the eye to be in focus. And of course, if you ever watch movies intensively, you see if two people are talking and one is in front of the other, the one or the other is blurry because it's impossible to, with the light, unless it's really bright, they won't both be in focus. Anyway, the child's brain is built to assume that the differences between two human-like objects are far more important than those between, say, two different mice or two different toys. Those faces are really important, and there is a bias toward facial identification. So the young mind is by no means a simple mind. Many of the specialized capacities we find in adults are already present in infants in the form of particular expectations, preferences, and the ways of inferring. So this is from the developmental people. So, for instance, as adults, we start with the concept of animal and then move down to animal-looking thing, to self-propelled thing, to thing with erratic motion. So think about it from a child's point of view. Erratic motion is the first thing that's noted. There's a kind of inference system, a skeletal system that identifies erratic motion. Why is that moving, that odd sort of thing? It might be a machine, but it might also be an animal. And then self-propelled thing becomes an important thing, and that could be mechanical, but mostly we see it in terms of animal. And then animal-looking thing, it looks like an animal. And then finally, animal as a concept. Strictly speaking, the animal concept, but something that that normally leads to something that leads to something that builds the animal concept. Something that leads to something that leads to something. In other words, you start with a skeletal or vestigial inference system that just recognizes the random movement and then begins to see the movement as self-propelled, and then so it's a skill thing. And the philosopher Ruth Millikan said that concepts are much less descriptions than skills. They are developed over time and elaborated. Okay. So all right. So having particular ontological categories, we talked about ontological categories in previous chapters. Ontological meaning category of being. The world lends itself to many ways of categorizing contents, and the choice depends on which species you belong to. So not all species do what humans do. they don't have the same inference systems. Some of them may have inference systems, but others have maybe a very different way of looking. We don't know the particulars of the face of a giraffe, for instance, or any giraffe. We don't care. It's not important to us. Faces of humans, however, are vitally important to us because of our social needs. And we develop that over time. Architecture and designer. Our inference systems may be there because they provide solutions to problems that were recurrent in normal human environments for hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, we're starting to get to the evolutionary reasons for these things happening the way they happen. We have a sweet tooth, for instance. Now, we live in an age where sugar is in everything. Too bad, but that's the truth, giving many of us diabetes. But that sweet tooth must have been important to our ancestors when they came upon sweetness very rarely, and they said, that's good, I like that, and they go after whatever it is. So they know that this is a good thing. There are many other of these things that became specialized inference systems. Detecting what makes some people reliable for cooperation is not the same as detecting what makes a potential sexual partner attractive. So there couldn't just be one system, which is not the same as evaluating whether a certain food is poisonous or not. So we had to develop not one system, but many systems to deal with many problems. And we, humans, are generalists. That means we can live in a variety of environments. We can change our diet. We can change our clothes. We can do all kinds of things to live in different places. We and rats are also generalists and live in a whole variety of places. So, for instance, caution in terms of toxins is important to us and to them because we might run into them more likely, whereas other animals just don't have that same problem, so they don't have those same inference systems. The evolutionary psychologists are dealing mostly with, since we are generalists and there are cognitive adaptations to minimize the danger of contamination and other things, these little systems, these subdomains, these inference systems are there to help us do all kinds of things. Paul Rosen studied the psychology of disgust, and it obeys specific inferential principles. First, it assumes that the source of danger is not necessarily visible. So you may see the carcass of the dead animal, but you're not going to eat it. You can't see why it is bad. You just know it's bad. It's not visible. First principle. Second principle is a contagion. It assumes that limited contact, however brief, is the source of danger and transmits the whole risk. So limited contact is a bad thing. Stay away. Third, the system specifies that any contact with sources of pollution transmits it. So, touching it, no. Being near it, no. We are all quite aware of this because of the pandemic, but this is an inferential system that saved some of our ancestors, and the ones that had that system, they survived and the others did not. Life in a cognitive niche. Information about the world around them, and they need to cooperation of members. Now, there are two things that humans need. One is information, Because we move into various environments, we need information about that. And second, we live in cooperative elements, so we need to know who is eligible to cooperate with. These are two very important parts of it. And this is done, at least to a certain extent, with the inference systems of the social mind. And what he says is here, hypertrophied social intelligence. Hypertrophy just means, like a hypertrophied muscle is a large muscle. Hypertrophied heart is a enlarged heart. Anyway, we need this because there are complex embedded problems that are to be solved, and keeping files on various individuals without mixing them up. We have to keep people clear. The only way to produce such complex thoughts is to have information about these different individuals, keep it in separate files, access several of these files at the same time, yet never confuse them. No other species does that. We do that because we need to cooperate, and we need to evaluate all the time who we're dealing with, who is trustworthy, who is not. Okay, a taste of gossip. Now, gossip is interesting because gossip is practiced everywhere, enjoyed everywhere, and despised everywhere. Now, there are a number. Gossip's important because we need information about other people, who we can trust, who we can't. Of course, there's also disinformation as part of that process, too. And the things that we know are most important are status, resources, and sex. Those are the three things we're really interested in. There are other domains, of course, but they're just not, who cares? You can gossip about the actors in Star Trek, but, that's not a big winner. We have a kind of reverse golden rule here. The universal contempt for gossip stems from two equally important factors. One is that as much as we want to hear about other people's status and sex and resources, we are reluctant to broadcast such information about ourselves. So the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In this case, what you aren't unwilling to do for yourself, you are disgusted by in other people. We don't like gossip for that reason. The second thing is we have to represent ourselves as trustworthy, because if we're part of a group, if we're in cooperation with people, the trustworthiness is very important. Adaptation to social exchange. So, social exchange. You're invited to dinner, you take a bottle of wine. Unless it's a Muslim family or somebody who you know doesn't drink, you take something else, cheese or something. Unless you know they're utter vegans, and then you're gonna have to figure it out. People become much better at solving complex logical tasks if they are presented as social exchange problems. Social exchange is something that we all know about, and it is very much a part of our life and our system. Evaluation of trust. Very important process. Diego Gambetta and Paul Bacharach have studied extensively the signals by which people evaluate others' trustworthiness by everyday situations. This requires that they compute both the significance of the signal and the probability that it is faked. Somebody's behind you, you're going into an apartment. This is very much a big city, New York kind of thing. They didn't ring the bell. They didn't talk to somebody from upstairs. Do you let them in or don't you? You're evaluating signals then. And then coalitional dynamics. We humans form coalitions, and coalitions are really quite complicated. And I'm not even going to try to summarize this because it's very specific and very easy to misrepresent. Decoupling and constraints. Decoupling is simply when you think about an experience in either the future or the past. You're contemplating doing something and you're thinking about it. Remember that if you are thinking about particular parts of that, like a gesture or something, your brain, those subsystems are all going to fire as you need them. But they're decoupled from reality of the moment, of the now. We have a big movement in contemporary life about living in the now, but we don't live just in the now. We live in the past and we live in the future. You get to my age, more of the past than the future, but you still, And as you contemplate those two different scenarios, which are not in the now, that is decoupling. And decoupling is a very important thing. And then constraints, not everything appears reasonable from the point of view of the future or the past. Like anything else, when you're dealing with hypotheticals, I'll tell you that I saw a tiger in the forest yesterday. You will probably infer that I was in the forest yesterday, because your intuitive psychology requires that condition. So you can't say, I saw a tiger in the forest, but I was in an office building. No, that's a constraint that's provided by the particular. Supernatural concepts are just one consequence of human capacity for decoupling. And what that means is that as we get into this a little deeper, as we begin to talk about byproducts and salient gadgets, these are really talking about very specialized parts of the human brain, like that which understands speech. We do that by segmenting sound. We divide it up. All normal humans have the ability to segment a stream of sound emerging from someone else's mouth in terms of isolated sounds, then send this purified representation to cortical areas specialized in word identification. So we identify words by, in other words, all this stuff is coming in, and the brain takes it and begins to chop it up into segments so that it can be understood. And all you have to do is listen to a foreign language thing, and you can't pick out the words. You don't know what they are because you're not used to that. That's not your language. If it is your language, your mind is segmenting and picking out those things. Also, there are visual cues, and from all of this, the interesting thing is this particular thing from hearing sound to produce words has made it possible for us to hear music. And music is kind of a purer form of segmentation. But it's a byproduct of the original system, which was to hear words. The same is true for the visual system. I mean, not exactly the same, but it has its own thing, and so visual arts come out of the very things that created inference systems for the visual process. He begins to talk about supernatural things again. There isn't much in this chapter. It's all about the organization of the brain. But he says, turning to the domain of supernatural concepts, such evolutionary reasoning may well explain certain forms of magical beliefs. For instance, in many places in India, it would be highly polluting to share food with a member of some low castes, say a tanner or blacksmith. Indeed, the whole household would need serious ritual cleansing. Most of the people there have no idea why it would be polluting, in what particular way this pollution would affect them, but they will certainly avoid such situations. So the contagion avoidance kind of thing is going on, but it's applied to a cultural affectation, or as they call it here, a salient gadget. Finally, religious concepts are to constitute salient cognitive artifacts. Those successful cultural transmission depends on the fact that they activate our inference systems in particular ways. The reason religion can become much more serious and important than the artifacts described so far is that it activates inference systems that are of vital importance to us, those that govern our most intense emotions, shape our interaction with other people, and give us moral feelings and organize social groups. I think we can see some of that seriousness in the political correctness kind of stuff that we're dealing with in our culture nowadays. But those are byproducts, really, of the inference systems that are in our brain already. Our next chapter will be why gods and spirits. So we're going to get back to religion now, but first we needed to know that this highly specialized inference system, concept, aware kind of experience that is our brain was important for understanding the religious reality of whomever. Anyway, we'll see. So thanks for listening.